Well, can't we just skip Leviticus? Come on now, you don't ruin the sermon. I actually titled the sermon that because I think it is how we so often approach the Bible. I often hear people say things like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to start reading the scriptures all the way through from beginning to end. And a story usually goes like this. Yeah, man, I started in Genesis, the first book of the Bible, and it went great. You know, you got God's creation, then you got all this family drama and dysfunction, and I could relate to that. And then I got to the second book, Exodus, and man, that was pretty cool too. You get slavery and Pharaoh and plagues and God liberating the Israelites from slavery. Then I got to the third book, Leviticus. And it just seems so long and boring and outdated and barbaric and like an endless list of shall nots. So I just stopped halfway through. That's usually how the story goes. And it's true. Without context, without putting this thing in its proper context, this is a long, boring book with a long list of shall nots if you want to be close to God. Don't do this if you want to be close to God. You know, just last week on our free Facebook page, we did a posting about tattoos, and someone responded. I want to share with you this person's response. I blocked out this person's name. I don't think you'd know this person anyway. This person doesn't live here, but shoot, I don't even know this person really. But they said, I have 2 tattoos. But after I read Leviticus 19:28, I wished I wouldn't have. What do you think the real meaning of this verse is? I get different answers, so I'm totally confused. I am not judging at all, but I feel like I have committed a bad sin getting my tattoos. To which I said, if you have 2 tattoos and you have sinned, well, my sister, I'm in some deep trouble here. I didn't really say that. But you see what happens without context. And I bet you're dying to know what chapter 19, verse 28 says, right? It talks about do not cut your bodies for the dead or put tattoo marks on yourself. And without context, it's like, well, what do you do with that? Maybe I shouldn't get tattoos. Maybe I should. But what we see going on here is this is speaking to the Israelites who've been brought out of the land of slavery in Egypt, and they're now wandering in the wilderness, and this was a pagan worship ritual. And so God's saying to them, you all are to be a different kind of tribe. I'm calling you to be a kind of tribe that goes out and loves all the other tribes and teaches them what love and freedom is, and don't join the pagan worship rituals, because you need to remember who you are. You are distinct. You are set apart. But see, without context, just a long list of shall nots if you want to be close to God. And I think Leviticus is better. Leviticus is better than that, because remember, let me remind you, Leviticus does not begin with law or judgment or condemnation. Leviticus begins with a God who is calling. If anyone wants to draw near to this God to express your joy, if anyone wants to draw near to this God because you've made a mess of things and you need to make things right, well then here's how you do it. Yeah, we need Leviticus. So we're going to spend the next few minutes in Leviticus. Now, the most basic breakdown of the book of Leviticus goes like this. It's 27 chapters. The first 7 chapters are all about the sacrifices, particularly the 5 sacrifices or 5 offerings. And then you get chapters 8 through 10. This is for the priest, instructions for the priest. They're the holders of the worship rituals. Then you get 11 through 15, which is instructions and rituals for being ceremonially clean and unclean. You get things like food and childbirth and skin diseases and bodily discharges. Doesn't that make you want to go read Leviticus? And then you get to chapter 16. It's kind of a set-apart one. It's about the Day of Atonement and purity, essentially addressing the question of what does it mean to be in right standing. And then you get the rest of the chapters 17 through 27, and it's what we call the Holiness Code. How do you live this stuff out? And you get things like blood, sex, clothing, slander, land, debt. Leviticus essentially says, get yourself sorted out so that then you can live it out. Now, here's what happens. Sometimes when we approach the Bible, and this is especially true if you have a Bible background, if you grew up with this stuff as a child, you will approach the scriptures, the temptation is to approach it in such a way where if you just read it enough, if you do enough digging, if you get enough historical context, then you're going to have all the answers on these really complex passages. To which I say, how boring. I mean, if the goal is just to have all the right answers, well, then what? I mean, then what? You've mastered the Christian faith? You've mastered the scriptures? Then what? No, we're entering into, when we get to this Bible stuff, we are entering into this ongoing dialogue. It's why one theologian says it this way. The goal isn't to finish, but it's to hear the music and dance with it. You read it, and it reads you. So for the next few minutes, we're going to let Leviticus read us as we read it. And here's the deal. We're going to be just flying high, the 30,000-foot view of Exodus as we dance with these texts. And we're going to move fast, and we're going to go hard for a few minutes. So stay with me. Are you ready? Oh, and I should tell you this. We're just going to be in the first two verses. How about that? The first two verses of Leviticus chapter 1. The first verse goes like this. Then the Lord called to Moses and said to him from the meeting tent. That's verse 1. Now a better translation with the original Hebrew would read like this. Then God continued calling Moses. And that's really important because this phrase, God continued calling, in the Hebrew, it's one word, and I want to teach this word to you because you didn't think we were going to get out of here without learning some Hebrew, did you? It's this word, Vayikra. V-A-Y-I-K-R-A. Don't change the K to a G. That gives you a different word, and I'm not prepared to preach on that word this morning. Vayikra. Say that word with me, Vayikra. Come on, give me a little passion with it. Vayikra. Yes, God, ooh, I like it. God continues to call. Now, in the Jewish tradition, you do not just approach Leviticus. You don't read Leviticus. You read Vayikra. You study Vayikra. God continues to call. On Wednesday afternoon, I was hanging out at Free, and someone walked in. I hadn't met this person before, but I learned that he came from the Jewish tradition, and we were talking about Hebrew, and y'all, I had notes going different places for this sermon. I wish y'all could have seen it. I had a good, ask Tammy, 3.5-hour sermon on these first two verses. Don't worry, I did do some cutting. But as we were talking about the Hebrew, I got all excited thinking about this, and I just shouted out, kind of probably inappropriately and weird. I said, Vayikra, Vayikra, do you know what it means? And he looks at me like I'm crazy. And he's like, yeah, Leviticus? Like the most important book of the Bible? Vayikra. God continues to call. Now, if God is continuing to call, that means there's been this ongoing thing happening between God and Moses in some sort of meeting tent. So that means we're picking up somewhere. So it's kind of like we started watching season 2. Any Walking Dead fans out there? Okay, a few of you. You pick your favorite show, but when it comes to Walking Dead, it would be like picking up in season 2 and saying, wait a minute, why is Rick Grimes going after Shane so hard? Because there's a backstory here. You got to see season 1 in order to answer that question. When we get to Leviticus, we are entering into this ongoing conversation that has been happening. So we're picking up on season 2, but we need season 1. Season 1, the backstory is found in Exodus. So stay with me, y'all. I know I'm going to give some details and historical information, but stay with me because we're headed somewhere. The book of Exodus begins with God's absence. The Israelites are living as slaves in Egypt. They are far from home. They are enslaved by Pharaoh, working for a master who has stockpiled food. Now, if there's a famine, where do they turn? To the master, to the pharaohs. The slaves were being forced to build these storehouses for the food that they helped Pharaoh get. And now they are begging this Pharaoh for food. Is it any wonder that when you read through the book of Exodus Egypt is consistently described as a place of injustice and inequality. Egypt is ordered in a very particular way, and the text tells us that the Israelites existed to be, this is the Hebrew word, used by Pharaoh. So do you understand how they could live in a state of despair, that tomorrow is going to be an endless repeat of today? But then you get to chapter 2 in Exodus. I'm not going through all the chapters, don't worry. But you get to chapter 2 and you get this beautiful passage. But God hears their cry. This God isn't okay with the way things are ordered in Egypt. Now, sometimes we get stuck in these political debates and these political conversations, and we say, well, I just want to know where God stands on this issue and who God sides with, because that's going to be the side that I stand on. That'll be the right side. Just give me God's side. Maybe that's the wrong question. Perhaps a better question is, for people of faith, for the church, can you hear the cry of the suffering in our midst? Can you hear the cry? And if I'm honest, some days I can, and some days I can't, for a whole host of reasons. I can't hear the cry. It's why we need community. It's why I need you and you need me and we need each other, because some days I won't hear it, but you'll hear it. And sometimes you can hear the cry, but they can't hear the cry. We got to help each other hear the cry of the suffering in our midst. So then the Israelites are liberated. You remember the story they're brought out of Egypt, where they're wandering around in a wilderness. And as they wander around, we get to chapter 25 in Exodus, and we're brought into this conversation where God tells the people, listen, I want you all to build something, a place where I will dwell and go with you everywhere you go, and this thing is called a tabernacle. So now they're wandering around in the wilderness, but God is present with them, and they're figuring out how to do community together, how to do life together. So Exodus begins with God's absence, but it ends with them wandering in a wilderness with God's presence. So chapter 1 of Exodus is essentially asking the question, God, where are you? Come on, God, where are you? And the last chapter, chapter 40, is the response. Right here. Right here with you, right here in your midst, journeying with you everywhere you go. So when we read in that first verse that there was this meeting between God and Moses in a meeting tent, the tabernacle, and it probably looked something like this, a setting, a tent-like setting that you could break down and reconstruct, and when it came to the tabernacle, this is a very portable symbol that would go with them everywhere they went to remind them that God is always with them, and there was very specific, endless verses in Exodus and in Leviticus about how to construct this thing. Instructions on what rituals could happen here and how those rituals were supposed to happen. Because this is something about God and people and the entire universe. The ordering of it is done with precision and distinction and detail. It has something to do with the ordering of the world in a brand new way. So when we read, then God continued calling to Moses and said to him from a meeting tent. It is the author telling us that God is inviting them to order the world in a brand new way. When you see this endless list of instructions, it's the author letting us know, think about the importance of reordering the world. Now, can y'all see why a reordering of the world in a new way would mean something to slaves being liberated from Egypt? Let's pause there for a moment. Have you ever found yourself set free of an old way of ordering your life? Think maybe of some toxic relationships that you've been a part of or been a witness to. You might have even had that thing where you say to yourself, man, why doesn't she just leave him? It's so oppressive. It's so abusive. It's like slavery. Why doesn't she just leave? Well, first of all, leaving isn't always the easiest thing to do. Easy for an outsider to say, well, just leave. And when that person leaves, some of y'all know this to be true, it's like that person has to relearn how to be human. That person has to relearn what it means to be in healthy relationship with others, people that actually treat them well because they've been beaten down for so long. Think about when lives are really, really messy. Order can be a saving grace, can't it? You know, I have friends who run sober living houses, and they all tell me the same thing. They stress the importance of structure and order. Because they tell me that when these people are coming into their homes, their lives are a mess, they're really messy, they haven't had boundaries in their life, they haven't had structure and order. So when you come into this house, we're going to get up at the same time, and then we're going to have breakfast at the same time and do group therapy at the same time. Then we're going to do this at the same time and go to bed at the same time, lights out at the same time. Order can be a saving grace. Or think about the moments when you look around the world and you say, man, what a mess. I mean, mass shootings, families separated at our border, all the messes you could point, entire groups of people being demeaned and marginalized and degraded. Man, what a mess. Vayikra, God continues to call. And it's as if God is saying to us, yeah, of course things are a bit of a mess, but together we're not a mess. Together we can create something new. Are you in? The greatest thing in Leviticus is this invitation from God, Vayikra, are you in? Do you want to create something new together? A few minutes on the second verse in Leviticus chapter 1. Because after God continued calling to Moses from the meeting tent, God said to Moses, speak to the Israelites and say to them, when anyone among you brings an offering to the Lord, bring as your offering an animal from either the herd or the flock. And then the next 7 chapters are about these offerings. 5 offerings. Each offering gets a chapter. Then chapters 6 and 7 are these very detailed instructions. You have the burnt offering, the grain offering, the peace offering, the sin offering, and the guilt offering. Now y'all check this out. We need one more Hebrew word because this is really important. The Hebrew word for offering is korban, and it means to draw near. Do you understand how mind-blowing and revolutionary this would have been for them? You can draw near to this God. This God isn't like Pharaoh. This God isn't hovering over you waiting to smash you. This God isn't abusive, isn't coercive, doesn't work in ways of power. This God is not distant or detached. You can draw near and be in relationship with this God. This God has not given up on you. This God will not leave you. This God is always with you. And then check this out. The first 3 offerings are all voluntary. So that means the burnt offering, the grain offering, and the peace offering, they're all voluntary. And they address the question of, what do I do with my joy, my gratitude, and my contentment? Yeah, these slaves have just been liberated from Egypt. What do we do with our joy, our gratitude, our contentment? And then the last 2 are what happens when you realize you have wronged someone, either intentionally or unintentionally. You've made a mess of things. How do I make things right? How do I make amends? I mean, how relevant? How relevant for these Israelites who have just been brought out of Egypt. Vayikra. God continues to call. You can draw near to this God, korban. And the first 3 offerings are about how to express your gratitude. We need that, don't we? The second 2 are how to then make things right. We need that. Leviticus, Vayikra is these former slaves being taught how to remake the world in a new way. I mean, think about it. They're in the wilderness wandering together. in close quarters. You think they made a mess of things sometimes? How to remake the world in a new way, not like Egypt, but in a new way. And to practice and live in such a way that God is dwelling in their midst, and they're being taught how to treat their neighbor fairly and to live with great intention. Yeah. We still need Leviticus, don't we? We need Leviticus because how many of you have struggled with the idea of God's absence? God, where are you? Come on, God, where are you? Vayikra. God continues to call. God continues to invite us to make the world a better place. How many of you have struggled with the idea that God is distant or detached or somewhere else, and your job is essentially just to be good enough to fly under the radar enough to keep God off your back because you were told somewhere along the way that God is filled with anger and wrath and judgment and condemnation? Korban. You can draw near to this God. You can trust this God. This God isn't like them. This God isn't like the other gods. This God could be trusted. And isn't it interesting? By the time we get to the New Testament, Paul and Jesus have changed the conversation because some of y'all are wondering, yeah, but in Leviticus, why all the sacrifices? Why the offerings of animals and bloodshed? What's up with all the blood? And Jesus and Paul say, no. God never needed the blood. You all needed that because that's how the other gods were, so that's how you functioned. You thought God needed the blood. God never needed the blood. What's Paul say? Romans. The whole thing is a temple. The whole world is a tabernacle. Then remember what he says? Let your life be a living sacrifice unto the Lord. I know you thought God needed the blood. Let your life be a living sacrifice unto the Lord. The God of Leviticus raises some interesting questions for us, doesn't it? How are we treating our neighbor? Fairly? And how do we make things right when we've harmed one another? How do I make things right when I cause a mess, intentionally or unintentionally? And how do we properly express our joy and gratitude? Vayikra. God continues to call. And this, my brothers and sisters, is the good news of Leviticus.